In this lesson, we'll look at one of the most foundational concepts and question tasks you'll find in the verbal reasoning, quantitative reasoning questions, and that's going to be assumptions and what you need to do with them when you're being asked to identify them as the task of the problem. So first, let's talk about how we identify assumption tasks. We begin by finding a reference to an argument or a recommendation in the question stem, so some sort of opinion. And you'll note some task words such as assumption, assumes, or depends that indicate you're being asked to find an assumption. Be careful of considering assumption tasks, though, as equivalent to strengthen. You're looking for something ultimately that must be true for an assumption task, whereas a strengthen is just to find information that would support the argument but isn't necessary for it to be valid. Now, strategically, you will want to pay especially close attention to the details of the argument when it comes to assumption tasks. You want to also recognize that extremes, quote unquote, can be necessary assumptions. So don't eliminate answer choices when you're being asked to find an assumption that seem like they are extreme, because the extreme may be necessary. You'll also, as we've been talking about in other lessons, want to try to categorically identify the type of argument to broadly predict what a possible categorical assumption might be. And you could use something called the negation test that we'll look at in a little bit to further eliminate answer choices when you get down to 2 or 3 options. Do recognize, though, that some answers will go too far about what is necessary and therefore are not 100% required by the argument. And of course, you can always eliminate more quickly if you find something that matches your prediction of what the assumption should be based on your preliminary evaluation of the argument and possibly a common argument. So you'll recognize our argumentation equation, and of course, the assumption sits right in the middle of the premise and the conclusion, the thing that must be true to link the evidence that's provided to the opinion that is requiring that evidence or support. So how do we identify assumptions in the argument? Well, you'll want to try to predict as specifically as possible, based on the type of argument, what must be true to reasonably believe the conclusion based on the explicitly given premise or premises. And by properly categorizing the argument, you might be able to notice details that could indicate otherwise overlooked leaps in logic. So you're like, actually, I don't know that these facts support this conclusion without the assumption in the middle. And you might be able to proactively say, this is actually what the logical gap or assumption is. So our common argument assumptions will start with an analogy. And of course, the assumption here is that the items in the argument are comparable in relevant ways. Our representation arguments are going to assume that the evidentiary sample is representative of some larger whole. Our data and evidence interpretation argument type is going to assume that there is no other reasonable interpretation of the data or evidence except the one that's been provided. And a causality is going to assume that there are no other possible outcomes or causes, and the circumstance is not merely coincidental. And our plan or recommendation type argument is going to assume that the execution and approach will work according to whatever the defined metric of success is. And remember that for all plans or recommendations, the default conclusion is that we will execute the plan. Otherwise, there's no point in mentioning it. So let's take a look at a sample critical reasoning prompt on the left here and see how we can potentially predict some common assumptions. Of course, we'll read the question stem to start, and we see which of the following is an assumption that the argument requires. So we see that term assumption clearly indicates the task. Then we're going to read the prompt as normal, and we've got agriculturally few resources are as valuable as fertile topsoil. However, one of the most prolific North American crops, corn, depletes this resource at a rate of 2 bushels of topsoil eroded for every bushel of corn harvested. Therefore, corn production in North America should be phased out in favor of crops that are less detrimental to topsoil. So we've read the prompt, and we can note specific terms such as should that can help inform what type of argument has been presented. In this case, it must be a plan because we've got a recommendation of something that should be done. So our conclusion is that plan. So corn production in North America should be phased out in favor of crops that are less detrimental to topsoil because of the evidence that's been provided. So we can broadly predict a specific and categorical assumption here based on this. We need to find something that must be true to believe that the plan to phase out corn production is necessary and will work basically to save the topsoil. So if we bring in our answer choices, we then want to process eliminate for our common wrong reasons, starting with choices that have a vague impact, such as choice B. Topsoil composition can vary greatly from one region to another. Okay. I mean, there is so much that's vague here. We're just highlighting can, but do we even know the regions are related to North America? I have no idea. So we can eliminate choice B pretty directly. We also can eliminate answer choices that require clear additional information, such as choice A, introducing the idea that corn is an integral part of most American diets. Wonderful. Does that? How does that impact the topsoil? I have no idea. It again may seem like we want corn to be phased out, but it has nothing to do with the metric that's directly presented about improving the topsoil. We also can eliminate things that are task reversals, such as things that shouldn't be true because they would weaken the argument, such as very few crops are as prolific as corn. Well, again, this isn't necessarily pertaining specifically to the metric, but it makes it seem like we shouldn't phase out corn production, so that would weaken the argument. Choice D would be a reversal, therefore. And we can also eliminate answer choices that don't need to be true, but might strengthen. So when we're looking at assumption tasks, some of the hardest answer choices to eliminate are going to be those that would seemingly make the argument better, but they aren't required. So erosion is the single biggest threat to topsoil in North America. It seems to strengthen the argument, but it's certainly not necessary by it. But if we look at choice C, fertile topsoil is an exhaustible resource. Well, that explains why we need to save the topsoil. And if fertile topsoil were not an exhaustible resource, well, then why do we need to do the plan? We will never run out of it. So who cares if the corn is detrimental to the topsoil? It completely destroys the recommendation, its validity. And that's how an assumption must work. It's the thing that is necessary in order to believe the conclusion at all. And of course, our correct answer here is C. So what we just did there is kind of a tacit negation test, in that we considered what would happen if choice C disappeared and the argument kind of failed. So we have our negation test for assumptions, and this should only be applied if you're looking at an assumption task. But ultimately, you can work the problem as normal, reaching 2 or 3 options by eliminating the choices against a proactively predicted assumption, as we did. And if you reach the end, you don't need the negation test because you were able to eliminate, find the correct answer. But if you've got 2 or 3 options that seem potentially viable, this is something that you can apply at the end of your process. You then take a remaining answer choice and negate its impact by adding or removing the word not from the main verb of that choice, or by applying what is known as a technically opposing quantity, and we'll see what those are here in a moment. Then step 3 is you want to apply the negated information from the choice to determine the impact of that negation on the viability of the conclusion. If nothing changes in the argument upon the negation of that information, or the argument strengthens once you negate the choice, you can eliminate that choice as unnecessary for the conclusion. And the logic is we took it away and the argument still worked, or it got stronger, so therefore the opposite wasn't required. But if the argument fails upon applying that negated information, you'll have to select your choice as a negated fail, indicating that what the original statement was is actually necessary for the conclusion, because when we took it away, the whole argument fell apart. So let's talk about those technical quantities. We'll define them by percentage. So quite simply, we know all is 100%. Simple enough. But if I were to ask you what is the opposite of all, you might say none. But that is not technically accurate, because our opposites have to incorporate all possible other options. And in this case, there aren't just the options of all and none, because none would be 0%, all is 100%. We'd miss everything in the middle. So our technical opposite of all is going to be not all, because that incorporates everything that is less than all, which is everything less than 100%. Then we talk about most, and most by definition in English is greater than 50%. And our opposing quantity is going to be not most, and that's the values that are less than or equal to 50%. Then we get to some, and some is going to be greater than 0%, and your opposing quantity here is none, because some is just greater than 0%, and none is the only exception to some. And the way that this all works is a little counterintuitive from like a conversational perspective. But if we consider the example of all dogs breathe oxygen, well, that's true because 100% of dogs on this planet breathe oxygen. but so do most dogs, which is not how we necessarily say it, but it's true that more than 50% of dogs breathe oxygen. Similarly, we also could say some dogs breathe oxygen because that's technically true as well. The only statement that would not be true is no dogs breathe oxygen because, in fact, some, most, and all do. So you can see through that example how these quantities and their opposites work. So make sure that you apply these technical opposites if you are going to negate quantities for your negation test. So let's take a look at another example here. And as always, we skip to the end, figure out what we're being asked for, and we see which of the following is an assumption on which the argument depends. So we recognize that we're being asked to identify an assumption. We then read the paragraph from the beginning. For a decade, annual surveys have provided regular information about the Donderonia hospital system, and those surveys have consistently shown that urban hospitals experience a much higher inpatient mortality rate than rural ones do. This clearly shows that Donderonia's rural hospitals are run better than their urban counterparts. And if you recognize surveys, that might indicate we're looking at some sort of evidence, some sort of data, or a representation based argument. So we find our conclusion as always, and that is Donderonia's rural hospitals are run better than their urban counterparts. And we then can broadly predict our assumption as there is no other info to reinterpret the data from the surveys, and there is no other possible cause for the higher mortality rate at urban hospitals than that they are run more poorly than the rural hospitals are. So we introduce our answer choices. And as always, we look for our wrong common reasons, and we'll get to the negation test if necessary. So we start by eliminating answer choices that are vague, such as choice E, outpatient procedures are more common in Donderonia than are inpatient procedures. Well, okay. I mean, outpatient procedures, you kind of need some outside information, and more common could be just like 1% or 0.01% or 99%. There's way too much of a range of more common, so we can eliminate that pretty directly. We also have to consider answer choices that require additional information, such as choice B that introduces the concept of neighboring nations. Donderonia's hospitals are considered inferior to those of neighboring nations. I know nothing about neighboring nations from the prompt provided. That would require additional information pretty directly. And similarly, choice D, the diets of rural citizens vary greatly. Again, I mean, we could call this vague too, but we don't know how those diets, whether they're better, whether they're worse. This can be a trap, though, if you assume that the rural diets are worse. Doesn't say that they are, so we can eliminate choice D for needing additional information as well. And we look for something that doesn't need to be true. And choice A and C both seem relevant. So we've got urban hospitals usually admit thousands more patients per month than do rural hospitals. You might go, well, okay, that makes it seem like the urban might be worse because maybe something's happening with those patients. You're not quite necessarily able to find something that's going to make this wrong. Same thing with choice C. We've got urban environments in Donderonia are not experiencing a fatal drug overdose epidemic. And you've got to be careful to not just say this is out of scope, because at this point, we could potentially use that negation test we just spoke about. So starting with choice A, we can insert do not before the admit. And if we consider urban hospitals usually do not admit thousands more patients per month than do rural hospitals, doesn't do anything to my argument. Like, okay, they don't admit thousands more patients per month. Still could be poorly run. I have no idea. So this has no impact upon negation, and we can eliminate choice A. But if we make choice C a little bit easier to understand by eliminating that not, that kind of makes it a weird double negative. If we said urban environments in Donderonia are experiencing a fatal drug overdose epidemic, well, now I've got a reason to believe that there's some other cause for a higher mortality rate in the urban hospitals, that they're experiencing a fatal drug overdose epidemic. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the rural hospitals are better run. They just might not be experiencing this fatal drug overdose epidemic that is currently in the urban environments. So choice C, through the negation test, we see how it directly is necessary for the argument in the affirmative, well, in its negative affirmative, in its original form, we'll put it. And that's how we know when we're down to two through the negation test, which one truly is necessary by negating the impact and seeing if the argument still holds. So our full process for working through these assumption tasks. First, identify the task itself by recognizing key indicator terms, assumption, depends, those sorts of things, and the presence of an argument with a main conclusion. Then you want to read the prompt as written, paying close attention to the type of information provided, and as always, note the conclusion. And if you identify a common argument, you can more specifically predict what a categorical assumption may be based on that premise. But if no common argument is identified, you can just use the generic prediction of find what must be true to believe the conclusion that ... whatever the conclusion is. And then step 4, eliminate your choices against the prediction using your common wrong answer reasons and apply the negation test if needed to eliminate and work through those last 2 to 3 options. You really shouldn't be doing this for every answer choice. And honestly, you probably need to do it at most once or twice, because once you determine that one of the answer choices is a negated no impact or a negated strengthen, the other one has to be the right answer, or vice versa. As soon as I find something that is a negated fail, I don't really have to consider the other ones. But you shouldn't be doing this for every answer choice because it's probably just not necessary itself, which is kind of ironic. And it's probably going to be too time consuming to do so. So let's head on over to our whiteboard to see how you'll execute a sample assumption task problem using your scratch work on the GMAT Focus Edition verbal reasoning section. As we set up our scratch work here, A through E, you probably are already noticing the key term here of assumption that indicates an assumption task. So you can just write assumes as the task, and I'm going to put PA up here as my predicted assumption place where I'm going to write out my prediction. So starting from the beginning of the prompt, we have an acclaimed conductor stating the cost of assembling a professional orchestra keeps all but the largest cities from having a symphony in residence. However, the value of a symphony to its community is priceless for the inspiration it provides to listeners of all ages. A smaller city could reap these benefits only by soliciting the largesse of wealthy philanthropists, but the efforts would surely be rewarded. So we've got this could reap by soliciting, so we've got a plan. So we want to find what must be to believe that the plan to, we'll just say, get dollars from our WPs for wealthy philanthropists is needed and will work to reap benefits of a symphony in a smaller city. So I'm not going to predict any more specifically than that, but I basically need to show that A, we need this plan, and B, that it's going to work. So choice A, all inspirational symphonies are comprised of professional musicians. Well, we're talking about symphonies, we're talking about professionals, and both of these things are in the paragraph. So at worst, I might just hold this with a squiggle for now. Then choice B, some quality symphonies are comprised entirely of amateurs. Well, we're talking about some quality symphonies. And I go, well, what's a quality symphony? I don't know. It's not defined in here, oddly enough. So this is going to be vague for a couple reasons. One, the sum, and two, what is a quality symphony? It's not a term that's used, so we can eliminate choice B. Then we've got choice C, many large symphonies without, or sorry, many large cities without symphonies desire to have one. Well, this concerns large symphonies. We're not talking about large symphonies. We're talking about large cities. We're talking about the smaller cities. So this has no impact either way. Then choice D, young listeners tend to care less for classical music than listeners of other demographics. Well, this introduces an entirely new concept of listeners, so this is going to need additional information to see how it's going to impact our plan with the wealthy philanthropists. And then we've got choice E, a number of philanthropists wealthy enough to support a symphony reside in smaller cities. Well, I might hold on to this as well, because at least, again, we're talking about philanthropist wealth, symphonies, smaller cities, all terms that are clearly in our paragraph. So at this point, when we're down to 2, we might want to apply that negation test. So we'll start with choice E. If we said a number of philanthropists wealthy enough to support a symphony, we'll go with do not reside in smaller cities. Well, that has nothing to do with this, right? Because I go, okay, there are a number of wealthy philanthropists outside of the smaller cities. Does that mean that there aren't any in the smaller cities? No, there's absolutely no impact by this negation. So this is a negated no impact. And that allows us to eliminate choice E. And on the exam, you might go, well, it's got to be A now. But we remember that our negation of all is just not all. So if we read not all inspirational symphonies are comprised of professional musicians, well, now I can potentially have a symphony without having to pay for it. And the entire point of this plan was that we had to pay for the symphony. So this would be our negated fail in choice A. And that's how the whole process should go when you're considering these assumption tasks. Eliminate things where are common wrong answers first off. I don't want to deal with the negation if I don't have to. But if you're down to 2, you could just apply the nots and see what happens when you take away a statement from one of the choices to see if it was a necessary assumption in the first place. So consider the negation test as you work on practice assumption tasks on your own to improve at this very important aspect of the critical reasoning questions on the verbal reasoning section of the GMAT Focus exam.